Okay, so our talk is entitled, Is Man More Than Matter? And the subtitle could be a response to what philosophers refer to as atheistic materialism or physical reductionism. That is the idea of reducing man merely to matter. Man does not have an immaterial human soul. So by way of introduction, I'd like to kind of start off with an objection from a very popular atheist and materialist by the name of Daniel C. Dennett. He's an American philosopher. He's a writer and cognitive scientist. In his book, Breaking the Spell, Religion as a Natural Phenomenon, Mr. Dennett writes as follows. He writes, quote, "It's this expandable capacity to represent reasons that we have that gives us a soul. But what's it made of? It's made of neurons. It's made of lots of tiny robots. And we can actually explain the structure and operation of that kind of soul, whereas an eternal, immortal, immaterial soul is just a metaphysical rug under which you sweep your embarrassment for not having any explanation," close quote. So Mr. Dennett is saying that our soul is nothing more than the firing of neurons within the brain. That our soul is not immortal, our soul is not immaterial. So do we have a sufficient explanation for the human soul as being immaterial, and as we're going to see, thus immortal? Or is our explanation of the human soul just this sort of what he calls a metaphysical rug under which we sweep our embarrassing doctrine of the immateriality of the human soul? So tonight's talk is basically a response to this materialist view of man. That view that reduces man merely to matter and rejects the idea that the human soul is immaterial, that the human being has a transmaterial or a transphysical dimension to him or her. So I've divided tonight's talk into 5 parts. The first part has to do with answering the question, why is it so important to establish the immateriality of the human soul? In other words, the fact that the human soul is not mere matter, but that it is immaterial. Why is that so important? And in answering that question, and in giving reasons why it's important, we'll see that it serves to be sort of an argument by way of a refutation absurdum. We can see the absurdities that the materialist view of man leads to, and thus establish why it's so important that the human soul is indeed immaterial and why we need to prove that. The second part of tonight's talk will consist of an argument for the immateriality of the human soul from the human desire for and awareness of what philosophers call the Five Transcendentals. And I'll explain that when we get there. Part 3 of tonight's talk will consist of an argument for the immateriality of the human soul from our human knowledge of what philosophers call forms or essences, or our knowledge of the nature of things. Part 4 will consist of an argument from near-death experiences and how there are modern, rigorously, scientifically established studies on near-death experiences that seem to point to the existence of a transphysical or transmaterial dimension of the human being. That there is something of the human being that survives bodily death. And that's simply from an empirical approach. And then finally, in our last part of tonight's presentation, I'll answer a few common questions that come up when we're talking about the human soul and its immateriality. So let's dive right in with part 1. Answering the question, why is it so important that we establish the immateriality of the human soul? Reason number 1, it gives man hope for life after death. In other words, the immateriality of the human soul is the very basis for the idea that the human soul is immortal. I repeat, the immateriality of the human soul is the very basis or the ground for the immortality of the human soul. Okay? If man has an immaterial dimension to him, then it logically follows that man has an immortal dimension to him. Why is that? Well, that which is immaterial is simple. It doesn't consist of parts. It doesn't have what philosophers call constituent parts. And if the human soul, if that which is immaterial doesn't have parts that make it up, well then guess what? It cannot break down into its component parts, which is the very essence of death. So if the human soul is immaterial, well then it logically follows that it's immortal. It cannot experience the decomposition into its component parts, namely death. But now the question is, well, why is it so important that we establish not only that the soul is immaterial, but why is it so important that the soul is immortal? So I basically have 4 truths there on your handout that we can deduce from the fact that the soul is immortal. 4 truths that we can deduce if we deny the immortality of the human soul. So for example, number 1, if the human soul is not immortal, okay, I repeat, if the human soul is not immortal, we're going to see where the denial of the immortality of the human soul leads us to. So if the human soul is not immortal, well then guess what? The idea of heaven or any sort of paradise in the afterlife is futile. It's pointless. Because if the soul does not continue to exist after this life, well then there's no sense in talking about any kind of heaven, right? So the immortality of the human soul is the basis for any sort of talk about a heavenly existence in the afterlife. Secondly, if the human soul is not immortal, well then guess what, friends? Man's life has no meaning. Now, meaning has to do with significance. It has to do with why something matters, right? Now, think about it. If man's not immortal, if there's no immortal dimension to man, and the human soul simply passes out of existence at death, well then man ends in nothing. And as the great theistic Christian philosopher Dr. William Lane Craig says, if man ends in nothing, then he is nothing, right? So if our end is nothing, and man simply passes out of existence, and there's no dimension to him that is immortal, well then man's life is meaningless. It has no ultimate significance. It does not matter. My life, nor anything I do in it, simply has no meaning. It has no significance. It does not matter, right? Okay? Thirdly, if the human soul is not immortal, well then man's life has no purpose. Purpose has to do with what is at the end of the trail, right? What is the goal? What is the reason for something? Well, if the end of my life is simply nothingness, and I simply pass out of existence, well then I am here to no purpose. My purpose in life is literally nothing. And that, my dear friends, leads to a dreary life. So if the soul is not immortal, we see so far the idea of heaven, futile. No meaning in life, no purpose in life. And finally, if the human soul is not immortal, well then guess what? Man's actions have no moral value. Listen to what Dr. William Lane Craig writes in his book, On Guard, Defending Your Faith with Reason and Precision. Dr. Craig is one of the world's leading Christian apologists to date. And he writes as follows: if life ends at the grave, then it makes no ultimate difference whether you live as a Stalin or as a Mother Teresa. Since your destiny is ultimately unrelated to your behavior, you may as well just live as you please. As the Russian writer Fyodor Dostoevsky put it, if there is no immortality, then all things are permitted. I repeat, if there is no immortality, then all things are permitted. My dear friends, if our life ends with the grave, well, then our actions have no moral value to them. Our destiny is unrelated to our human behavior. So it literally does not matter, as Dr. Craig said, if you live as a Stalin or a Mother Teresa. Your actions have no moral worth to them if we do not live on after this life, if our human soul is not immortal. So we see why it's so important that our human soul is immortal, which leads back to the conclusion of why it's so important why our human soul is immaterial, right? So that's the first reason why it's important to establish the immateriality of the human soul. It grounds the idea that the human soul is immortal. It gives us hope for life after death and immortality, which we've seen already is very important. Amen? Reason number two why it's important to establish the immateriality of the soul. It gives man transcendent dignity and value. Think about it. If man is only a material living creature, within his dignity and value is nothing more or does not go beyond the dignity and value of an animal or a plant. If man is mere matter and the human soul is not immaterial, well then we would have to agree and conclude with Ingrid Newkirk, who's the president of PETA, People for Ethical Treatment of Animals, when she writes as follows, quote, animal liberationists do not separate out the human animal. So there is no rational basis for saying that a human being has special rights. A rat is a pig, is a dog, is a boy. I repeat, a rat is a pig, a rat is a pig, is a dog, is a boy. This is the logical conclusion from man being mere matter. No transcendent dignity beyond the material world. No dignity and value that goes beyond the dignity and value of animals or plants. So if man is mere matter, then we're mere animals, and thus we have no special worth within the material world. That's the second reason. Third reason why it's important to establish the immateriality of the human soul. It's the ground of the reality of morality. Let's think about it. If man is mere matter, right, and the human soul is not immaterial, simply material, well then guess what? Our human actions would simply be the byproduct of physical, non-rational processes within the body. Our human actions would not be moral nor immoral. Our human actions would be amoral. For example, take an oak tree. If an oak tree grows up and crowds the growth of the neighboring maple tree, is the oak tree being immoral for crowding the growth of the neighboring maple tree? We say absolutely not. Why? Because it's simply doing what its material constituents make it do, right? It's simply doing what its matter constitutes it to do. It is a natural, physically determined process. The action of the tree, if we can even call it that, crowding out the growth of the neighboring maple tree, is neither moral nor immoral. It's amoral. Okay, well, if the human being is only matter, well then the actions of the human being will simply be the byproduct of physically determined processes that make up the body or make up the human being. Those actions would be neither moral nor immoral, like the oak tree. They would be amoral. So, for example, if a man would murder and rape an innocent woman, could we blame such action? Could we say such an action was wrong if he's only made up of matter? Of course not. Why? Because such an action would only be the byproduct of physically determined processes that make up his body. He would only be doing what his material constituents constitute him to do. That's what his matter makes him do. He is physically determined to act in such a way, and thus it's neither moral nor immoral, it's amoral. So you see how by reducing man to mere matter, in this materialist worldview, you actually pull the rug of morality out from underneath your feet. You have no ground for morality. But the majority of atheists actually assert morality and are moralists. Nobody in their right mind would say, well, a man who happens to rape and murder an innocent woman, well, we can't really blame him because that's just the way he's materially constituted. Nobody in their right mind would agree with such a statement. So the flip side of that is true. We see how the immateriality of the human soul actually grounds the reality of morality. Does that make sense? Okay, let's move on to our fourth reason. The fourth reason why it's important to establish the immateriality of the human soul is because it grounds, not very much like it grounds the reality of morality, it grounds the reality of human knowledge. And it does so on two levels. First level, the immateriality of the human soul allows for the freedom of thought, which is a necessary condition for human knowledge or human reason. Okay? Let's think about this for a second. If man is mere matter, and the human soul is not immaterial, well then what would our thoughts be? Very much like our human actions, our thoughts would simply be the byproduct of non-rational physical processes of the brain. Our thoughts would only be the firing of neurons within the brain. Our thoughts would only be the byproduct of chemical actions and reactions within the brain that are physically determined. Does that make sense? Well, if our thoughts are physically determined by these chemical reactions of the brain, is there any freedom of thought within that? Of course not. But then someone may ask, well, why is freedom of thought necessary for human knowledge or human reason? Freedom of thought is necessary for human reason precisely because when we reason, what do? We come to know certain ideas. We have to be free in our intellectual capacity to judge these certain ideas, to compare and contrast, and then judge which one is true, which one is false, etc. To make a judgment of what is true or false in regard to ideas requires a freedom of intellectual judgment. Physical determinism excludes freedom of thought. And if you exclude freedom of thought, guess what? You exclude the possibility of human knowledge. So to reduce man to mere matter and say that man does not have an immaterial soul, you therefore negate the very possibility of human knowledge. Thus, we see why it's so important to establish the immateriality of the human soul. Another level where another level where the immateriality of the human soul grounds human knowledge. It allows for the reliability and validity of intellectual judgments. Very simple. If our thoughts are mere byproducts of chemical actions and reactions in the brain, right? Why should I trust such thoughts if they are physically determined? So let's take, for example, the materialist, right? What is the materialist? What is the thought of the materialist? The materialist thinks man is merely matter, right? Well, in his worldview, that thought, guess what? That thought is simply the byproduct of non-rational physical processes. Well, if that's the case, why should he even trust his belief that man is mere matter? Furthermore, why should he even trust the belief that his brain is even made up of atoms and the firing of neurons? Because that thought is simply physically determined, the byproduct of non-rational physical processes. So we see that by reducing man to mere matter, we negate the possibility of human knowledge. And the flip side of that is true. The fact that man does have an immaterial dimension and thus is not mere matter actually allows and grounds the possibility of human knowledge, human reason. Amen? So we see that it's absolutely important to establish the immateriality of the human soul. If the human soul is not immaterial and is only matter, it leads to absurdities that violate our common human experience. Reason number one, it's important because it grounds the doctrine of the immortality of the human soul, and we've seen why that's so important. Secondly, it gives man transcendent dignity and value beyond the animal kingdom. Thirdly, it grounds the reality of morality. And fourthly, it grounds the reality of human knowledge. And so that's why it's important to establish the immateriality of the human soul. So let's begin to do so. Now we come to the second part of tonight's talk, and that is an argument for the immateriality of the human soul from the human desire for and awareness of what philosophers call the Five Transcendentals, okay? The Five Transcendentals simply refer to these 5 areas in which seemingly humans have a desire for perfection in. These areas that seem to transcend the material world and our common human experience, and that is knowledge, love, goodness, beauty, and being. These are the 5 transcendentals. Now, there are 5 steps to this argument for the immateriality of the human soul from the human desire and awareness for the 5 transcendentals. 5 steps. First step simply has to do with establishing our desire for perfection in these 5 transcendentals. We commonly experience this human desire for perfect knowledge or truth, perfect love, perfect goodness or justice, perfect beauty, and perfect being. This is the first step. We want to establish our human desire for perfection in these 5 transcendentals, okay? So let's do it. What about the human desire for perfect knowledge or truth? Well, it's a common human experience, right? That we're always seeking more and more knowledge about things. It almost seems as if we're never completely satisfied with the answers to the questions that we get. We seem to always be pursuing more answers. Philosophers refer to it as this desire. There seems to be a desire for a complete set of answers to a complete set of questions. This desire for complete intelligibility, a desire for perfect truth, a desire for perfect knowledge. This is why we consistently seek more and more knowledge and never completely satisfied with the answers that we get to our questions, because we desire complete intelligibility. I think this is evident in the field of science. Scientists are always seeking better and better explanations of the universe. In fact, physicists are looking for what they call a TOE, a theory of everything. And there's a few candidates of that, although science could never explain everything about everything because it's limited in its very scientific method, but that's a whole nother topic. But the point is that scientists are always seeking more and more knowledge about the universe. And in fact, they're aware. Notice how they're dissatisfied, discontent with their level of knowledge about the universe, always seeking more. I think it's also evident in children, right? When a child asks a question, we give them an answer, to which they respond, well, why is that? And we give another answer, and they respond, well, why is that? And it almost seems as if the questioning could go on indefinitely if the adult doesn't put it to a stop, right? This desire for more and more knowledge seems to indicate that we have a desire for complete and perfect knowledge. The fact that we are discontent and dissatisfied with the answers that we get to our questions in certain levels of knowledge, always seeking more, reveals a desire for perfect knowledge or truth, a desire for complete intelligibility. What about about the human desire for perfect love? This is pretty obvious. It's a common human experience. We all have experienced frustration, right? When someone fails to love us in the way that we desire. Case in point is husband and wife in marriage. What happens when one of the spouses does not show concern for the other spouse's interest, is not kind to or gentle to or loving of the other spouse? What is the common experience? Frustration, disappointment. Whenever one of the spouses fails in love, there is frustration and disappointment. We have to ask the question, why is that the case? And the answer is because we desire perfect love. That's why we get frustrated when there are failures of love in certain circumstances. What about the human desire for perfect justice or goodness? I think we're all aware of the common human experience of frustration when there's a manifestation of imperfect justice. Take for example, if a parent gives a treat to one child and not the other, as the minute I give a treat to one of my children, the other one's literally at the same. I want one, and if I wouldn't give a treat to my other child, what would they say? That's not fair, right? What about a professor? Let's say a professor hypothetically would give A's to only boys in a class and not to the girls simply because they're girls. What would be the response of the females in the class? They would respond, that's not just, right? That's unjust. So we see that we experience dissatisfaction with certain manifestations of imperfect justice. What would that reveal? Why are we dissatisfied? I think because we desire perfect justice. What about levels of goodness? Think about this. For example, teachers or parents may be dissatisfied with a certain level of education at a school, right? Thinking that it could be what? That it could be better. Or what about a boss who might think that his employees are not producing to a certain level or certain standard of goodness that he desires? He's dissatisfied with that certain level of production. What does he call for? He calls for a greater level of production. So that discontentment with certain levels of goodness or imperfect goodness reveals a desire for perfect goodness. Our discontentment with imperfect manifestations of justice reveals a desire for perfect and complete justice. What about the human desire for perfect beauty? Well, it's a common human experience that we're dissatisfied and discontent with certain forms of beauty, right? Maybe we don't look good enough, or somebody else doesn't look good enough, right? Or maybe our home is not quite laid out as it should be. Always dissatisfied with certain forms of beauty. Or maybe, perhaps, I think we've experienced this here in the Pacific Northwest. We go for a hike. We get up at the top of a mountain from a particular vantage point. We look over the valley. It's breathtaking. It's beautiful. We sit there for a few minutes. We enjoy the majesty of God's creation, and then what happens? Well, let's go a little higher and see if we can get a better viewpoint, right? And we go a little higher. We get another vantage point, and it's beautiful, and we go higher and higher and higher. Always looking for better forms of beauty. Why is it that we get bored with forms of beauty that we experience? I think perhaps because we desire perfect beauty. And finally, the fifth transcendental, the human desire for perfect being, or what some philosophers call perfect home. Perfect home. That is a desire for perfect harmony within the totality of things. Now, Father Robert Spitzer, president of the Maja Center of Reason and Faith, calls it perfect home. And rather than me trying to explain it to you, I'm just going to let him speak for himself from his book, New Proofs for the Existence of God. He writes the following in regard to this human desire for perfect home or being. He writes, quote, "Human beings also seek a perfect sense of harmony with all that is." So there's the key operative word there, perfect harmony with all that is. They not only want to be at home in a particular environment, they want to be at home with the totality, at home in the cosmos. Have you ever felt, either as a child or an adult, a sense of alienation or discord? A deep sense of not belonging? You ask yourself, what could be the source? You look around and see that at this particular time, you have a good relationship with your friends and your family. Your work relationships seem to be going fairly well. Community involvements have produced some interesting friends and contexts in which you work. Yet, something's missing. You don't quite feel at home in a general sense. Yet you do feel at home with family, friends, organization, etc. You feel like you are out of kilter with and don't belong to the totality. And yet, all the specific contexts you look at seem just fine. You feel emptiness, a lack of peace. Yet, there's absolutely nothing you can put your finger on, close quote. I don't know about you, but when I first read that passage from Father Spitzer's book, I was able to identify with that. I thought to myself, yes, he's describing my human experience. How often I experience subjectively this sort of alienation. I look at all the specific context of my life, and everything's perfect. Not absolutely perfect, but you get the point. My family's good, my work is good, I have good church community, I have good Catholic friends who support me and are generous and loving and affectionate toward me. Everything seems fine, but yet in a totality of things, there's still this sense of discord. Why is that? As Father Spitzer points out, it's because we have a desire for perfect harmony. My experience of harmony in this life is still limited and imperfect, causing discontentment within my soul, thus revealing a desire for perfect harmony, or as he calls it, perfect home. The philosophers call it perfect being, okay? So that's step one. We've established the human desire for perfect knowledge, perfect love, perfect goodness or justice, perfect beauty, perfect being. We desire perfection in these five transcendentals. Amen? I think that's pretty obvious. Okay, so let's move to step two of this argument from the human desire for the five transcendentals. And that is, it has to do with our awareness of it. I would suggest to you that our desire for perfection of these five transcendentals reveals an awareness of perfect knowledge or complete intelligibility, perfect love, perfect goodness, perfect beauty, perfect being. I repeat, our desire for the perfection of these five transcendentals reveals an awareness of perfection of these five transcendentals. Notice something. Notice that when we're dissatisfied, let's take just for example, to simplify it, let's take for example our desire for perfect knowledge or our desire for complete intelligibility, right? Notice that when we're dissatisfied with certain levels of knowledge or certain answers to our questions, notice what we're doing. We're making an intellectual judgment that this level of knowledge is incomplete. We're making an intellectual judgment that this level of knowledge is imperfect. Well, how is it that we're able to perceive a particular level of knowledge to be not complete, imperfect? The only way we can make such a judgment is if we are in some way aware already of complete knowledge, of complete truth, perfect truth. I must be aware of this complete standard of knowledge in order for me to judge particular levels of knowledge to be incomplete. Does that make sense? In some way, I am always already beyond the limited levels of knowledge that I experience in my life. If I was not aware of complete knowledge already, well then guess what? I would be completely content with limited levels of knowledge. I would be completely content. I would not get dissatisfied with answers to my questions if I was not aware already of complete intelligibility, right? The answers to my questions would be completely sufficient for me. If I wasn't aware of complete intelligibility, I would never seek more knowledge. I would be satisfied with my level of knowledge. Think about this. Take, for example, a wall, right? I would not realize, as you see here in the illustration on the PowerPoint, these guys would not realize they're looking at a wall, a boundary, or a limit unless they were aware that there was something beyond it, right? If they did not have an awareness that there is something beyond, well, then it would just be opaqueness, blocking their vision. And they wouldn't even perceive it as blocking their vision, right? Because they would have no awareness that something is beyond it. So the only way I can discern something to be a limit, a boundary, a lack of completion, an imperfection, particularly in regard to knowledge, is if I am aware of a complete knowledge that is beyond the limited knowledge in my human experience. Does that make sense? So to repeat, in summary, our desire for perfection of the five transcendentals, and particularly, for example, our desire for perfect knowledge, implies and reveals that I am aware already of the perfect, complete set of answers to the complete set of questions, i.e. perfect knowledge or perfect truth. I am already aware of perfect love. I am already aware of perfect goodness or justice, aware of perfect beauty, aware of perfect being. And this awareness allows me to judge particular forms or expressions of the transcendentals to be incomplete. If I didn't have the awareness, I'd be totally content with these levels of the transcendentals, these experiences of the transcendentals in this life. All right. Now, this leads us to step 3, and that has to do with the nature of the awareness. The question is, okay, well, what is the nature of this awareness of the perfect? This awareness is what philosophers call a tacit or notional awareness. In other words, it's not explicit, and it's important to note that, right? Take, for example, once again, my awareness of complete knowledge that allows me to judge particular levels of knowledge to be incomplete. That awareness is not explicit. It's not an absolute awareness precisely because I don't know all of the content of complete knowledge, right? I'm limited in my knowledge. I don't know all of the content of the knowledge, but yet, in some way, I must be aware of it because I'm able to judge particular levels of knowledge to be incomplete. I seek more and more knowledge. And so philosophers call this awareness like a tacit awareness, a notional awareness. It's not explicit, it's implicit. It's implied. It's almost as if perfect knowledge, perfect love, perfect goodness, beauty, and being is somewhat like present to my consciousness as a background. It's like tacitly there. It's not explicit, but it's tacitly there, like a background present to my conscience, against which I'm able to make judgments about incomplete levels of knowledge, love, goodness, beauty, and being. So that's the nature of the awareness. It's sort of like this tacit notional awareness that's present to my consciousness, so like a background knowledge. Now this leads us to the next question. Well, whence did this awareness come? This awareness of the perfect in regard to the five transcendentals that allows me to judge particular levels or expressions or experiences of the transcendentals to be imperfect. Whence did this awareness come? This leads us to step 4, which has to do with the origin of this tacit awareness. And I would suggest to you that this tacit awareness of complete intelligibility, perfect love, perfect goodness, perfect beauty, perfect being comes from some transcendent reality that is the perfection of truth itself, love itself, goodness itself, beauty itself, and being itself. The perfect being we call God. Think about it. Can this awareness of the perfection of the five transcendentals come from anything in this world? Can it come from any of my human experiences? I think the answer is no. Why is that? Because it's precisely those experiences that are causing dissatisfaction and discontentment. It's precisely those human experiences that I'm judging to be incomplete and imperfect. So my awareness of the perfect can't come from those human experiences. Makes sense? Well, what about my brain? Maybe it's coming from my brain and the chemistry of my brain. Well, that's absurd because my brain is regulated by finite structures. It's restricted to space and time. And the transcendentals of knowledge, love, goodness, beauty, and being seem to transcend the material world, seem to transcend space and time. But my brain is restricted to space and time and the structures and the chemical processes that make up the brain. So it doesn't seem that this awareness of the transcendentals and the perfection thereof can come from my brain. So if it's not coming from my human experiences in this life and in this material world, and it's not coming from anything in the material world such as my finite brain, well then it must come from some reality that is outside of the boundaries of the physical material world. Something that's transcendent, a being that is the perfection of these five transcendentals, a being that is perfect truth, that's sort of present to my consciousness as a background knowledge, a being that is perfect love, perfect goodness, perfect beauty, perfect being. That perfect being we call God. And so now we have to ask the question, well, how does this awareness of the perfection of the five transcendentals having its origin in God, how does that prove the fact that we have a transphysical or a transmaterial dimension to us? How does it prove the transmaterial, immaterial nature of the human soul? And this leads us to step 5. I would suggest to you that this tacit awareness of the perfect being reveals the transphysical, transmaterial nature of the human soul. And the question is, how so? Well, think about it, my friends. If perfect knowledge, love, goodness, beauty, and being are things that transcend the finite material world, right? As we've already indicated. Well then, my power to desire these things and my power to be aware of these transcendent things must transcend this material world as well. Think about it. How could something of the material world, how could something that's restricted and confined to the material world, such as my brain, desire and be aware of something that totally transcends the boundaries of the material world, namely that which is immaterial, perfect knowledge, love, goodness, beauty, and being? How could something restricted to the material world desire and be aware of something that's outside of that restricted boundary? In other words, to put it bluntly, how could matter produce non-matter? How could matter be aware and desire something that's not matter or immaterial? The brain cannot be aware and know perfect knowledge or be aware of perfect knowledge, love, goodness, beauty, and being. Therefore, the power that allows me to desire and be aware of these five transcendentals and the perfection thereof must be immaterial. It must be some transcendent dimension within me that allows for such operations and such powers. So thus we conclude that the human soul must be immaterial and man is not mere matter. And there we have an argument for the immateriality of the human soul from the human desire for the five transcendentals and the perfection thereof. Easy enough? Okay? That's fairly simple. Okay? Now, if that was a little bit intellectually challenging for you, the next part is where we really sort of dig deep into philosophy. So I'm going to ask that you bear with me, okay? I do not want to err on the side of simplicity to where I sort of lose the thrust of the argument and actually fall into some sort of philosophical error due to simplicity. I want to try to do my best to present the next argument for the immateriality of the human human soul, even though it is a bit intellectually challenging, okay? We'll see how I do in presenting it to you, and hopefully it's clear enough to where you can sort of see the framework of the argument. And so let's move to now part 3 of tonight's talk, and I'll try to work our way through this argument, and then we'll take our break. And that is the argument for the immateriality of the human soul from human knowledge of what philosophers call forms, or essences, or the nature of things. I'll explain as we go on, okay? So I have 3 steps to this argument. Step 1 is this. Human beings have a capacity to extract from material things the form of the thing, or what philosophers call the essence of the thing. We're able to extract and know the form of things. Let's look at a few examples, okay? Take the example of a triangle, right? If I draw a red triangle, a blue triangle, and a green triangle, what do I conclude about all 3 of these objects? They're all what? Triangles, right? If I draw a triangle on the chalkboard, in the sand, or a triangle made of ink on paper, what are all 3 of these things? Triangles. If I draw a big triangle, a medium-sized triangle, and a small triangle, what are all 3 of these things? Triangles, right? So notice that in this example, there exists an essence, a nature, or the form of triangularity, right? Sort of the form of triangularity that I'm aware of, with which I'm able to judge these particular things to be what? Triangles, right? And notice how no matter what the material makeup of these things are, no matter what the material makeup of these particular triangles are, I still know the form of triangularity. It remains the same. It runs across all the different instances of triangularity. So notice the size, the color, and what it's made of does not constitute the essence of triangularity. The material makeup of these things that distinguishes one from the other does not constitute the form of triangularity. You know, these particular instances of triangularity, they could change in their material makeup, or they could go out of existence. But what happens to the form of triangularity? Stays the same. That's right, good. It remains the same despite the different particular instances, or what they call instantiations, of the form of triangularity. And because the form of triangularity remains the same, philosophers call it's a universal, right? It's not particular, it's universal. It remains the same despite the particular differences of each individual triangle. So notice, the material makeup of each particular triangle does not constitute the form of triangularity. It remains the same. The form of triangularity remains the same, thus it's universal. It's easy enough? Let's look at another example. Let's take the example of a human being. Let's say I have the 3 philosophers before us. We have Socrates, we have Plato, and we have Aristotle, right? What are all 3 of these beings? What do we call all 3 of these beings? Men. They're all men, right? Notice how, despite the difference or the particulars of Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato, there's a nature, an essence, or a form of man. There's manness, so to speak. A form of man that I'm aware of, with which I'm able to judge this particular being to be a man, that particular being to be a man, and that particular being to be a man. And very much like the triangles, the material makeup that distinguishes Socrates from Aristotle or Plato, whether he's tall, short, wide, or thin, the material makeup of that particular man does not constitute the essence or the form of manness. So once again, we see that the form of man stays the same despite the particular differences of the instantiations of the form of man. So we say that the form of man is universal. The material stuff that makes the particular instances of the form of man do not constitute the form of man. So this is what we conclude with forms. Forms are sort of like the archetypes, right? Or the standards by reference to which we refer in order to judge what particular things are, whether it's a dog, whether it's a triangle, or whether it's a man. And the material stuff that makes up these particular things does not constitute the essence or the form of which that matter is the form of. Okay? So forms. The human beings have this capacity to extract and to know the forms of things. Right? Form of triangularity, which is a universal. Form of man, which is universal, remains the same despite the particular different characteristics of each particular instance of man or instance of triangle. Got it so far? Okay. All right. Well, that wasn't too bad. That was probably a semester's worth of philosophy there in about 10 minutes. Okay? Now, let's move to step 2. And that is the forms that we know are immaterial. This is so important. The forms that we come to know are indeed immaterial by nature. Let's go back to our example of the triangle. Recall how I said the material makeup of each of the triangles does not constitute the form of triangularity, right? Consequently, we said the form of triangularity is a universal. It remains the same. So if nothing of the material makeup of the thing, of the particular thing, constitutes the form, well then the form is not matter. There's nothing of matter with the form of triangularity. The form of triangularity is over, above, and beyond matter and the material makeup of things. So the form of triangularity must be immaterial. It's an immaterial idea that's present within my mind. When I know triangularity and thus say, well, the red thing, that on the paper, that's a triangle, and on the chalkboard, that's a triangle, and in the sand, somebody drew a triangle. The form of triangularity that I have in my mind with which I'm judging these particular instances or these particular things to be triangles, that form of triangularity is immaterial. It's not restricted to that particular material example of triangularity, or that one, or the other. So the forms are immaterial. Does that make sense? Okay? All right. Now, this leads us to step 3. Okay? And step 3 is this. If humans can know immaterial forms, well then humans must have an immaterial power. If I can produce immaterial ideas, well then I must have an immaterial power. Why so? How so? Why is that? 3 reasons, okay? So here we go. 3 reasons why it is the case that if I can produce an immaterial form or idea, I must have an immaterial power, and thus man has an immaterial dimension and man's not reduced to mere matter, right? First reason why this is the case. Folks, if the mind or the intellect is merely material, well then the effect, namely the thought of triangularity, would be greater than the cause, namely the mind. Let's go back to our example of the triangle. When I think of the form of triangularity, what is the effect? The effect is the form of triangularity, right? What is the cause of that thought of triangularity? We say the mind, right? Okay, well, we know that the form of triangularity is immaterial, right? Well, if the effect is immaterial, then the cause, namely the mind, must be immaterial as well. Why? Well, as St. Thomas Aquinas once said, whatever perfection is in the effect is also in the cause. You cannot give what you don't have, right? So if my mind is producing immaterial effects, namely the form of triangularity, well then my mind must be immaterial as well. Does that make sense? So once again, if the intellect were merely material, the effect, namely the thought of triangularity or the form, would be greater than the cause, which is an absurdity. Therefore, the intellect cannot be merely material. The intellect must be immaterial if it's producing these immaterial thoughts, such as the form of triangularity, or at least I should say knowing the form of triangularity. Reason number 2. Why we can conclude that we have an immaterial power if we're producing immaterial or knowing immaterial forms. Number 2, listen, the assertion that the intellect is merely matter, to identify the mind with the brain, my dear friends, leads to all sorts of absurdities. Okay? Let's go back to our discussion about forms and the particular instantiations or instances of forms. Let's use the example of a dog, right? Okay? What is a dog? Well, philosophers would basically say a dog is a parcel of matter that has the form of dogness. I repeat, a parcel of matter that has the form of dogness, right? Okay? If I look at a dog, I have that particular dog, and let's say I have another particular dog and another particular dog, 3 particular dogs in different shapes and sizes, different colors, right? Different breeds. But what do I abstract from all 3? Dogness, okay? And then I can go and experience other particular instances of dogness and judge that's a dog. You get the point? Okay, so what is a dog? A parcel of matter that's instantiated by the form of dogness. Matter with the form of dogness equals dog. Get the point? Okay, now watch this. If my mind is merely material, and my mind is identified with the brain, right? What's going to happen when I come to know the form of dogness? What's going to happen when the form of dogness is in my mind and my mind is only matter? Well, if my mind is only matter and the form of dogness is in my mind, what would I have? I would have a parcel of matter instantiated by the form of dogness. And when you have a parcel of matter instantiated by the form of dogness, what do you have? A dog. So if my mind were mere matter and I know the form of dogness, my mind or my brain in the materialist view would become what? A dog. It would be matter instantiated by the form of dogness, right? Well, whenever you have matter instantiated by the form of dogness, you have a dog. Did you follow that line of reasoning? If my mind were mere matter and I knew the form of dogness, then you would have matter instantiated by the form of dogness, which equals a dog. Therefore, my mind would become a dog. My brain would become a dog. But you say, that's absurd, Carlo. Precisely the point. To reduce the mind to mere matter, in light of our human knowledge of forms, leads to an absurdity. Furthermore, we can show another absurdity based upon this line of reasoning. So if my mind were mere matter, let's say I know the form of a dog and I know the form of a cat. So what happens? Well, my mind, which remember in the materialist view is mere matter, right? So what would we have? We would have matter being instantiated by the form of a dog, therefore my brain would become a dog, but matter, that same matter, also instantiated by the form of a cat, becoming a cat. So what would you have? You would have a dog and a cat in the same place at the same time in the same respect. Did you get it? If mind is mere matter, I know the form of dog, I know the form of cat. Well, if the materialist view is correct, well then my brain would become a dog and a cat at the same time in the same respect at the same place. You say, that's absurd. Precisely the point. To reduce the mind to mere matter leads to absurdities. That's the second reason why we must conclude that that humans have an immaterial power if they can know immaterial forms of things. Now we move to reason number 3. The third reason why we conclude we must have an immaterial power if we can know immaterial forms. And that is, the assertion of the intellect as merely material contradicts the common human experience of knowing universals. Once again, we go back to the example of the triangle. Recall that we said the form of triangularity remains the same despite the particular differences among each instance of triangularity, right? And because that form of triangularity remains the same, we said it's universal. It's not a particular instance of triangularity. What is a particular instance of triangularity? Matter instantiated by the form of triangularity. So now we come to human knowledge and our human thoughts. If my mind is only matter, my intellect is only matter, and I know the form of triangularity, what do I have? I have matter instantiated by the form of triangularity, right? Well, whenever you have matter instantiated by the form of triangularity, what do you have? A particular triangle, not the universal form of triangularity, right? So if my mind is only matter, and I know the form of triangularity, well, then you have matter instantiated by triangularity. But whenever that's the case, that's a particular triangle, right? But we already showed that we do know universals. We do know the form of triangularity, which remains the same despite particular instances of triangularity. So to reduce the mind to mere matter would contradict the common human experience of knowing universals. It negates our knowledge of universals, which we know to be true, as we already demonstrated. So, in light of these three reasons, it's reasonable to conclude that we as humans have an immaterial power precisely because we can know immaterial forms, the form of a thing. And thus, we have an argument for the immateriality of the human soul from human knowledge of forms. Amen? Okay, so let's go ahead and take a break, and we'll just get our goodies. We'll come right back, and we'll just keep on trucking.